Hello, I'm Bob and Roberta Smith. I'm an artist and I make art about you. I make art about the relationship between me and you because art is like love.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Priyesh Mistry. I'm a curator here at the National Gallery. It's wonderful to see you all here for this evening's talk. I'm absolutely thrilled that we're standing in front of this glorious painting by J.M.W. Turner. Perhaps one of the most, we're celebrating Turner's birthday this week as well. So I'm thrilled that actually we're joined here by Bob and Roberta Smith, who's chosen this painting for this evening's talk. And also, I have to say, it's brilliant that we have not just one fantastic British artist, but two, with Bob and Roberta Smith joining us this evening, as part of our series of talks called The Unexpected View. And this is a series where we invite an artist in to come into the gallery, to select a painting as the subject for a talk, to explore its themes, its subjects, some of the ideas, perhaps the life of the artist as well, and use some of those subjects to think about the artist's own work as well. Perhaps to learn a bit more about the painting, but also to learn about how contemporary artists work today in all of the different myriads of ways that they do. Before I continue, we should thank Hiscox for their generous support of this series of talks and this evening as the National Gallery's contemporary art partner. So Bob and Roberta Smith is based in Ramsgate. And if you don't know his work, he uses words either painted on canvases, made into signs, written in newspapers, or sung in songs to make statements about art and free expression. His work has influenced generations of educators and students to embrace the idea of art as a human right. He believes that all schools should be art schools. Are you ready?
Yes. What should all schools be?
Art schools.
I can't hear you, National Gallery. What should all schools be?
Art schools.
We'll stop there with that one. We'll take that to
As well as his commitment to arts education and numerous museums and galleries, in 2015, Bob and Roberta stood in a general election in the constituency for the MP Michael Gove, who was then Education Secretary, to directly confront him over his diminished focus of teaching art in schools. You should all, some of you might have the pamphlet from that time. Since the early 1990s, Bob collaborated with other musicians and artists to create a lively art music scene with his band, the Apathy Band, and also regularly broadcasts a radio show on Resonance FM. So you might be able to tune in and listen into that. I know we'll sort of touch on some of these projects and other projects throughout the talk, but also explore Bob's interest in Turner as well, and perhaps some of the synergies between your work and the way that Turner might have worked as well. Bob has shown at MoMA PS1 in New York, as well as at Tate Britain and Tate Liverpool. In 2019, he had major retrospectives at the Harris Museum in Preston, and the La Pantinée in Montpellier, curated by Nicolas Buriot. You may have seen his work recently at the Royal Festival Hall during the half-term school holidays for the Imagine Children's Festival. And you can see his paintings currently at Tate Modern, this fantastic series called the Thamesmead Codex, which I hope we might touch on during the talk. And also, continuing, like all of those years ago, like Turner, Bob is a Royal Academician, and you can see some of his works currently in the Keeper's House if you go round to the Royal Academy. And Bob was also awarded an OBE in 2017. I think that deserves a round of applause, but we can do that later on. So we're
how you feel about
very honoured to have you here, Bob.
Oh, it's very kind of you to invite me.
So, out of all of the paintings, we had a really interesting discussion about, coming to do this talk, opened up the entire gallery. How did we come to Turner, but also how did we come to this painting in particular?
Well, it's a long story, and there's so many different aspects of it. But I'm a child of an artist, two artists actually, and they used to bring us to the National Gallery. So I've been coming here since I was really little to see paintings. And actually over the years I've done a couple of talks for the National Gallery, and I've talked passionately about how the Van Gogh Arles is my favourite painting. And on Front Row the other day I talked about how the Caravaggio Supper at Emmaus is my favourite painting. But actually with my really thinking about this seriously, about this invitation, I thought about the relationship with my father, and my dad wrote a sort of chapter. It was originally published as an individual book in the 1960s. He wrote a book on Turner's Peace Burial at Sea, which was his favourite painting, and there were so many different strands to it. But one is that my dad was a painter. He was obsessed with Turner. And the other is that we're both obsessed with the Great Western Railway. So, because it's God's wonderful railway. And that whole Victorian period, late Georgian period, is such an extraordinary period in Britain. And he wrote in this book about how Turner was born in 1775 into what is essentially an agrarian country, where you could walk amongst sheep from the centre of London in half an hour. But towards the end of his life, we were in the Industrial Revolution, and this painting represents that a little bit. So all of these funny stories float around in my head. So, and this idea of the railway, we'll talk more in depth about the painting, but the idea of the painting, but also, really importantly, Turner was a regular guy. And in this book, almost the first thing that he says, he talks about Turner being the son of a barber, and Turner's dad selling Turner's drawings in his barber shop. Well, one of my earliest experiences is my dad taking some of my drawings and taking them to the local butcher in Yorkshire and hanging them up and saying to the butcher, what about sticking these up in the butcher's shop? And so when I was about 11, I had this sort of drawing of this hill, Pen Hill, in this butcher's shop in Leyburn in Wensleydale. And I thought, well, what's that about? And then I was reading this book, and I suddenly realised that it was to do with his love of Turner. And, my dad was a regular guy. He started life mixing margarine on the Fulham Road in the Blue Band margarine factory. He identified with Turner because Turner was a self-made individual, really. He, it wasn't really about class, but he understood that Turner's journey through making artworks constructed Turner. Turner went on it's a cliche to say he went on a journey, but his life is about discovering the world, responding to it, sometimes opportunistically, sometimes with great love and warmth, through making artworks. And I think that's why my dad was so obsessed with him. And it's also slightly Turner, this relationship with Turner being somebody who is, seeing an event like the coming industrial world, or maybe he made an amazing painting of the Battle of Waterloo, which is all these corpses at the Battle of Waterloo with women or lovers pilfering the corpses or looking for keepsakes. It's not an image in that time that Wellington would have wanted of the Battle of Waterloo, but he makes that image. And through his life, there are these moments where Turner interacts with the society of Britain in that period in a unique and revelatory way, unlike any of his Royal Academician pals. So there's a bit about the railways. We can talk a bit more about this painting, but it's really this kind of idea of what an artist is. And Turner is very different from every other artist. He's almost very different from any. It's not. I mean, there are very few contemporary artists who operate in that way. So he is a unique kind of character. He has a conception of art as a social engine, as a thing of self-discovery. And then there's the painting itself, which is beautiful. So it's not just the enterprise of it, but it's actually mind-boggling. So it's all of those things. That's a long, shaggy dog answer.
But I mean, I adore your response and that idea that your father, Frederick Brill, was setting you up on this kind of Turner-esque journey. Should we talk about the painting and what we see in it? So the painting shows this moment of a train traveling through the storm, battling the elements. You see it traveling across the Maidenhead Viaduct, and this swirl of the mix of the rain, the steam coming out of the train, the light that sort of pierces through all of these kind of moments. It's quite extraordinary the way that Turner was pushing painting to really show the experience of what it was like to be in that kind of environment. And it shows that exactly as you said, that moment of real change, real progress in society with all of these, all of the achievements of the Industrial Revolution. We think that actually, we assume that perhaps these new inventions were traveling quite slowly, but this train was traveling at 60 miles per hour at that time, which is perhaps slow by today's standard, but phenomenally fast at the time, And calling the painting Rain, Steam, and Speed, it's about that experience of all of those things, right?
It is. It's all about. It's a painting of. It's a painting really of everything. Everything happening all at once. And, I mean, you can romanticize about it, but it is a painting of, it's also an impossible painting. All of these paintings, I mean, we've got some other really earlier, but really magnificent Turners surrounding it. They're all made in the studio. So it's he's not on Maidenhead Viaduct with this canvas making this. It's an act of the imagination. I mean, he has this vision, and there were lots of drawings. Turner was all about making drawings, not taking paint out into the landscape, but making lots of drawings and then improvising, extemporizing, innovating in his studio, making these paintings. And it's an amazing act of the imagination, like a piece of magic, really. But it's everything, and that's the thing. It's about experience. It's about the human experience, the experience of water hitting you in the face, the experience of the sound of the train. All the senses are there. You've almost got the taste in your mouth of a really crappy day in Maidenhead. And so it's and it's also, this is another thing which is quite conceptual and philosophical painting, because it's a moment. It's an image of a moment. That train is moving. It's not a static image. So it's a bit like his obsession with the wave. The wave comes, it swells, it grows, it dies. The train is like that. And in a way, the train is a human invention, but the train is a wave. The train is speeding across that viaduct. And it's a very poetic thing. I think there's lots of things that he may or not be saying, but what he is obsessed with in much of his work is that moment, the moment of the light hitting the Thames estuary at Margate and creating Venice. The moment of the swelling wave, the moment of this train speeding across this, and it's all an invention. That's why he's so amazing, because he did it. You know, he was able to make these extraordinary images of this fleeting thing. It doesn't exist, this painting. That it didn't sit on that bridge for half an hour while Turner made some drawings of it. It never existed, but it exists. You know, that's the amazing thing about it.
What I really enjoy about Turner, and particularly in this painting, is the sort of signals, the little signs that he makes to tell us that this is traveling at great speed, that this is quite a phenomenon, you know, to be within this storm. So there's little symbols of showing the speed. There's a little sort of painting of a hare running in front of the train, you know, perhaps kind of, you know, symbolic of the idea of the racing hare, you know, the speed of this train. Perhaps it will kind of be faster than the train, perhaps not, we don't know. You've got also the signs of the life before industry, you know. So you've got a boat traveling here with, you know, two small people with an umbrella, you know, trying to shelter from this storm on the river. You've got a man with a cart being pulled up by two cattle or two horses on the other side. So that he's making this deliberate contrast, you know, to say that we've advanced. This is the new age, in a way.
Absolutely, you know? Yeah. And it's a curious train as well, because it's definitely an early steam train. I mean, I think Tate Britain did a show of Turner a few years ago, and they made a poster, and they had this train which was from the 1950s whizzing through a filthy storm or something. It's completely wrong, really, in a way. And this train is definitely a train from this. This is 1840, isn't it? It's definitely sort of early period in the Industrial Revolution. And this bridge is, I mean, it's brilliant to think about this, because this is really, I mean, maybe it's an obvious thing to say, but it's a bit like painting Captain Kirk going up to the stars in Elon Musk's spaceship. It's very similar. You know, it's a very similar idea, because it's going into the stratosphere. You know, we're going into the weather. We're going into, you know, the elements. And this is an image of the future. This bridge is built by Brunel. It's a very radical piece of engineering, because it's a viaduct. It's built out of Portland stone, I think it is, and it has very shallow arches. And when it was, you know, kind of handed over to the Great Western Railway, the Great Western Railway was so freaked out by these shallow arches in this viaduct that they said, don't take the wooden structure which was built to support the workers building the bridge, the kind of template. Don't take that away, because we don't believe it will stand up without it. And of course, it's still there today. And at some point, there was a storm and swept away the wooden structure. So when Turner was making this image, that bridge had only been built a few years before. So it's a celebration of, it's a celebration, really. I mean, it's obvious, it's been said a million times before, but it's a celebration of a kind of modernity, isn't it? Yeah. It's a celebration of human ingenuity, but it's also, and it's contradictory, you know, it's a celebration of the elements, you know, that can wash it all away, and it's a celebration of our ingenuity, all colliding at the same time. It's not, you know, it's not oppositional. These things are happening both at the same time. It's very exciting.
Yeah. And it symbolizes that change, you know, which I think is really, it's a sort of painting that commemorates and marks that moment of great change. Bob, you've included Turner quite frequently in your works, I think, you know. But also, you've made a sort of sculpture, a sort of portrait of Turner.
Yeah, I made a sculpture of him recently. Yeah, which I showed.
It might be an image of it floating around the room.
Yeah. It's a bit hard to describe, but it's a series of wooden boxes with a story about Turner on it. And I was thinking two things. I was thinking, I mean, I don't want to talk about Timothy Spall too much, but I don't believe in the image of Turner from the Timothy Spall movie. When I saw Mike Leigh's film, I thought the character was much more like Charles Laughton's portrayal of Rembrandt, but also Charles Laughton portrayed the Hunchback of Notre Dame as a kind of idiot savant kind of character, you know, a kind of peculiar, strange kind of character. And I don't see Turner like that. I think if you had met Turner, he would have been like Michael Caine, or he would have been like Alan Sugar, or he might have been like Esme from the Sewing Bee. I think he was a no-nonsense kind of character, but he wasn't an idiot savant. He was a self-made man, and I think a lot of the accounts of Turner are from critics of him later on, from this period of paintings, and then the paintings, when the paintings became even more radical, when they became almost white-on-white paintings, when they said that he was making paintings with soap suds. People used to be... Punch was incredibly cruel about him and his paintings. But also, fellow Royal Academicians who were from a completely different background, they understood that he was a genius, but they didn't understand where it had come from, and they didn't understand him. So I wanted to make a sculpture to sort of say, that's not what Turner was. And also, in our conception of Turner, of course we look at the paintings. The paintings, his bequest is an extraordinary thing. The paintings that he left to the nation upon
including
his death,
this one.
including this painting. You know, this was unsold. You know, this is in his studio when he died. His bequest is actually what the Tate Gallery is. And this is the interesting thing about it for me. So, well, this is one of the interesting, there's so many things that interest me about Turner, but one of the interesting things about Turner is that he leaves his whole artwork to the nation. He leaves it really to the National Gallery. So the bequest becomes to the National Gallery. The Tate is actually the National Gallery's collection of British art. And that gets hived off at a certain point and goes down to Millbank. It's only in 1937 that name Tate comes about. And it comes about because we have the Turner's bequest, we have the National Collection of British Art, which is the National Gallery's collection of British art handed over to that institution, and we have Henry Tate's collection of Pre-Raphaelite paintings. Well, one of the stories on that sculpture, and this is the principal story on the sculpture, is that Turner, 4 years before he paints this, he paints this painting, The Slave Ship Zong. Well, Turner was an abolitionist at the end of his life. He made a painting that's in the Tate called The Deluge. He gave prints of that to be sold to raise money for the abolitionist cause, and he paints this painting, The Slave Ship Song. This is a totally, you have to accept the imagination for this, and we don't know what Turner would have thought. But I don't think, it's in 1937 the Tate is called the Tate. I don't think Turner would have been happy that his bequest in this institution named after sugar production, basically. Slavery ended before ended around the time that before Turner died, but I don't think that Turner would have been happy with that. So the point about the painting is to sort of open that question up. And then I thought, well, that's great. Let's call the Tate the Turner. That's the answer to all our problems. Let's just call the Tate the Turner. And then I started talking to a curator at the Tate, and she said there's been all this research by a guy called Sam Smith, and she's found out that Turner had a share. When he was a young man, he bought a share in a sugar in a plantation, a cattle plantation, which was worked by slave labor. So then that becomes very interesting. So I thought, well, that's thrown my idea out of calling the date the Turner. But hold on a moment. Then you sort of think about it. And when Turner, I'm going off on a long shaggy day, but it's one of the reasons why I really admire Turner, because he responds to the world and he wants to make a piece of art about it, you know. When he's a young man, he's on the make. He becomes a Royal Academician when he's in his mid-20s. And there are a lot of Royal Academicians there quite young, and they're invited by a man called Borthwick, and then also the guy who built Harewood House, Lascelles, to make topological pictures of the buildings that they're building to create great cathedrals or neoclassical mansions, money that they made from slavery. And in that period, Turner buys this share, and a couple of other Royal Academicians do as well. So they buy this share in this cattle farm. Go and have a look at the information, if you're interested in this, by this research by this amazing guy, Sam Smith. But he's unearthed this story. But what is interesting to me is then we talk about journeys that people are on. Then Turner, as a young man, is on the make. I don't think he gives a sod about slavery. You know, he doesn't care. But as the journey of that late Victorian period happened, with the abolitionist movement, a growing awareness about slavery, and then to, you know, turn on the state to stop slavery, Turner becomes part of that. So I'm very interested in this sort of journey that he goes on. He's also painting, as I said, he paints the battlefield at Waterloo. He also paints. He's also obsessed with the Houses of Parliament that burned down during his lifetime, and he makes these incredible images of the Houses of Parliament burning. So he's engaged absolutely with the world. We look at these images now, these other images that are here. I mean, that's what happened. I mean, this getting off at Calais, trying to get on at Calais, that's what happened yesterday. You know, they are images of now. And the sea, the channel, they're powerful images of humanity and our relationship with the sea, our borders, the news. I think he's always interested in the news and trying to captivate things. The paint captivates something that's happening. The painting Peace Burial at Sea, which is a painting around about this period, which has this great kind of miasmic sunset in it, is him wanting to commemorate the death of David Wilkie, and he goes, aha, I'll do this, and we'll exhibit it in the summer exhibition. So it's seeing a story like a journalist, seeing a story and going, I can make art about this, and we'll stick it in this context. The Slave Ship Zon painting was exhibited, we think, in 1841 at the Royal Academy. Well, that was to coincide with 3 conferences which were all about the end of worldwide slave trade. Well, the end of the worldwide slave trade, and this is one of the things that I talk about in this sculpture, the end of the worldwide slave trade, of course, that was a humanitarian effort, but it was also Gladstone thinking, well, how are we going to keep the prices down on the production of sugar? I know, we'll get people from India. So after slave trade, there was indentured labor. So all that sugar production, that was all created by people signing up in India to a better life and being shipped over to the Caribbean and then working in those sugar plantations. So the end of slavery in the Caribbean was not the end of the pernicious colonization period. It was just a shift in the dynamics of it, really. And so all these people from the Indian subcontinent were shipped over to the Caribbean to work on sugar plantations. So it's all tied up there. And somehow Turner, he's not an agent in it, but he is it's very interesting to think about art's relationship with politics and art's relationship with the world, art's relationship with humanity. But also, it's not just didacticism. He is amazing, you know. And this painting, these other paintings are extraordinary. They're much more easy to understand. But this painting is this beginning he dies in 1851, but in the 1840s, he's in this amazing period where he's absorbed all this, and he's going crazy with what he can do with paint to create these amazing atmospheric paintings.
I wanted to pick up on a few things that you said there, but as everyone can tell, Bob is an incredible storyteller. And
bit of a shaggy dog. There's lots of different strands to this story.
But in a way, I wanted to draw it to your own work, because your own work takes the form of words, of signs, and you expand that to these narratives, to the story to turn a story, not just on a painting on a canvas, but actually three-dimensionally. So you're walking around this sculpture, reading this narrative as you go. Could you talk a little bit about how you came to that, how you came to sort of communicate these stories and these narratives through signs, through sign writing, through words, in paintings, you know?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's funny to think of somebody who makes this, although it's got a bit of yellow smeared across it in relationship to Turner. But the thing is, I suppose about 30 years ago, it might be, I made a piece of work where we made concrete boats, and we took them to the Serpentine. It was actually with Anthony Wilkinson, who's here now. And we took these concrete boats to the Serpentine, and we asked people to try and float these impossible concrete boats. And actually, in that moment, although we hadn't come up with a term, we were doing something which was about the relationship between me and you. You know, it was about trying to get the audience involved. I hadn't absorbed Brecht at that point, but that's what Brecht was doing. You know, he wanted the audience to be engaged. You know, so when I get you to shout all schools should be all art schools at the beginning, there's a kind of Brechtian aspect to that. And so the idea of the signs came about from saying, well, how do you get people to do something a bit outside of the norm? You know, how do you get people to do that? So you make a big sign, maybe an even bigger sign that'll get more people to do it. If you make a really big sign, people will really believe in what you're doing. If you make an enormous sign with a great deal of authority, people will do exactly what you say. They do that when you do that on the side of a bus and you say that you're... Anyway, we won't go there. But if you make a really dirty, great big sign and tell people to do something daft, they'll do it. And so it's kind of thinking about this dialogue between language, and so that took me into this world of making work with lettering. And previously to that, I'd been living in the States, and I was interested in lettering and sign writing, and I did a bit of sign writing in the States. And so somehow this dialogue, it was a kind of, I don't want to get Ponzi and conceptual, but it was kind of dialogical art. It was a kind of trying to get people to do things. Make your own damn art. That's one of my slogans. Don't expect me to do it for you. Make your own damn art. That's why all schools should be art schools, so that people can make their own damn art. And that's the whole point of it, really. It's sort of not to absent myself from the art game, but to say this is for everybody. You know, art. Well, I mean, one of my mantras at the moment is that calling yourself an artist is a bit daft. You know, it's a bit like we can all fall in love. It's like calling yourself a lovist. You know, art really is very like love. Art depends on, you know, dopamine. You know, it depends on a certain kind of energy and relationship. And so art is actually very like love. So in a way, to call yourself an artist really is a bit daft. You might as well just call yourself a human being. So So the dialogue between me and the audience, and between the audience and somebody else, one of the things that really freaked me out at the beginning when I started doing All Schools Should Be Art Schools, and this was opportunistic. So Michael Gove came into power in 2010, and he was opportunistic. He thought, right, we're going to have this coalition government, and we can ditch our manifesto and just say, look, we're going to have this thing called the EBAC, and that's going to minimize the arts in schools, but it'll maximize mathematics and the study of English, which we all want to do. You know, we do want kids to study mathematics and be good at English. But it minimized the arts in schools. That was opportunistic, and I was opportunistic. I thought, well, this gives me an opportunity to say to him why the arts are important, and it ended up with me organising a conference in Scarborough, which was about 10 years ago now, and it also led to me running against him in his constituency. And so I did a big painting, letter to Michael Gove, and we took it down to his constituency. We actually marched it past Parliament at one stage. And when I see the Slave Ship Song, it's a much more weighty issue. But I know what Turner's doing there. He's going, right, I'm going to nail these bastards. I can do it in the only way that I know how, which is by making something. And then I'm going to exhibit it somewhere. And it will become a bit like the Magna Carta. It'll be a charter for activity and action, which perhaps I can't do, but others will be inspired to do. And so it's slightly like that.
I want to talk about the Thamesmead Codex, because I think this is just the most sort of powerful work on view at Tate Modern at the moment, so I encourage you all to see it. But in that work, you tell other people's stories, particularly from their experiences, perhaps before the pandemic, but also afterwards as well. Could you talk a little bit about that process of making that work, and then sort of putting all these stories together?
Yeah, so the Thamesmead Codex, which is it's the longest exhibition that's ever been at Tate Modern. It's really just the installation of some paintings, but they call it an exhibition, and it's great in a way. But it's been extended and extended and extended. Now it's going to be on till December. But it's this thing of art being, it's a bit glib, but if you think about art being a dialogue, it's a conversation. So interviews is the thing that I do. So I've done paintings of interviews. I did a painting with an interview with an amazing surgeon called David Knott, which was an amazing piece of radio journalism by Eddie Mair and David Knott, and talking about his time in Aleppo. And I made a painting of that. We exhibited it at the Royal Academy. I've been able to sell it and give the money to the David Knott Foundation. So this idea of the interview, the dialogue between the artist and the person, or the conversation, is the important thing. And so I was invited to do this, to come up with an idea to collaborate between Tate Modern, which is all about modernism, and this iconic piece of modernist housing, utopian in its vision, in Thamesmead. But it gets a bad rap because it's in the Clockwork Orange. Malcolm McDowell stabs his mate in the lake as he's trying to get out. That scene where he's stabbing his fingers. It's like that. So it gets a terribly bad rap because of that. And it's also a bit bonkers. It's got Belmarsh right in the middle of it. So that is where Nicholas Assange is at the moment. It's totally, and it was conceived as housing, but in that period when it was built, there weren't that many jobs available for people. It's all based around the car. There's no public transport to it. There is now. There's Abbey Wood. So there's an idea there that it's about a utopian vision that's gone a bit wrong, and the idea was to talk to people. But of course, when you talk to people, you realise, I don't want to say everybody's got a story, but you realise everybody's a person, everybody's got something to say, and everybody's got their experience. So it's trying to capture something of the experience. Doesn't do it justice at all, but it tries to capture a moment in Thamesmead. And the stories people told were absolutely amazing. And then COVID happened, and I had to do the interviews. So if you go and see this thing, the coloured ones are all interviews where I met the person one-to-one. The black and white interviews are interviews that I did over the phone with people. But that became very powerful because they were on this estate. Two of them were waiting for the made-up exam results. One wanted to be a brain surgeon, and I was thinking, he's never going to be a brain surgeon. How is that going to happen, you know? And, you know, it was very moving. There were I don't know, it's very complicated to go into it. There were a lot of very moving stories about it. The two people who set up the first shop on the estate, their job was really, on a Saturday night, to stop people stealing steaks after they'd watched the football. And it was just, you know, it was just very moving. And then I made and then that got me painting again, actually, in a pictorial way, because I thought it's going to look like a very conceptual piece of art. There's just all these texts with all these interviews with people. So I thought I need to tell people where this is visually. So I started making some images of the Thamesmead estate. That was exciting again, because that put me back in this world of this dialogue with Turner and my dad, really. You know, kind of trying to make an image of something that's impossible, really. And so anyway, go and see it. It's
Well, I recommend you all see it, but I want to just say that it also represents, I think, the generosity that you have with your work. You know, I think we've all kind of heard it already today, but the way that you use signs to communicate, to bring you know, an audience into these stories, into these worlds. And perhaps that's also a way that we should be thinking about Turner as well, you know, that his work, as you said, as artists, you know, you give in a way. Turner was also so generous in the way that he showed the world, the way that he marked the world with certain moments of social change or social issues that actually needed to be out there in this public world, in this public forum. We're going to have to wrap it up.
Yeah, we haven't even talked about why Turner is John Coltrane.
Oh, we can talk about why Turner is John Coltrane, but I think it's sort of self-explanatory, no?
Well, this is a quote from a friend of mine, a wonderful sax player called George Cleghorn. And I did an interview with him, and he's talking about how he picked up the sax. I won't go on a long time about it, but I interviewed him in Petworth House, where Turner painted these amazing elegiac images of the sun setting over the lakes at Petworth House. And he said Turner was Coltrane.
I think we end there. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. And thank you, Bob. That was brilliant. That was amazing.